This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number... Damn, just lost my place. Just a minute. Trouble in real time. This is flyer number 362, entitled Women's Sexual Selection of Men's Frontal Lobe Switch Off. Description. This flyer hypothesizes that women sexually selected the phenomenon of men's frontal lobe switch off to women's advantage, making it easier for women to sexploit men, brainwashing men to provide women with male-hunted meat, to keep women who could not hunt and their useless infants alive. Flyer itself. Women's Sexual Selection of Men's Frontal Lobe Switch Off by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer hypothesizes that the evolution of men's frontal lobe switch off was due to women's sexual selection of the phenomenon. For those of you who are not familiar with the phenomenon of men's frontal lobe switch off, I begin with an explanation of what it is. When men see their regular female sexual partner, the frontal lobe of their brains switches off. The frontal lobes are responsible for planning and critical thinking. Women don't have this phenomenon, so are much better placed than men to remain objective when faced with their male sexual partner. This lack of symmetry is to women's advantage, since they are in a stronger position than men to think rationally, to plan ahead than men, who are not thinking at all when they see their female sexual partner. Rather, they are feeling a rush of pleasure hormones, reminding them of the pleasure of orgasm associated with the sight of the source of that sexual pleasure, that is, the sight of their female sexual partner. The interesting question arises: how did this asymmetry arise? How did it evolve? Why did it evolve the way it did? This flyer suggests an answer to this question, namely that women sexually selected men who suffered this affliction, that was so much to women's advantage and not to men's. This flyer now elaborates on this hypothesis that all men should be aware of. I begin with a bit of prehistory. Women evolved to be parasites on men, to be prostitutes to men, in order to be better, more effective parasites on men, better able to extract resources, usually meat, from men. The pre-human baby's brain doubled in size in a mere 1,000,000 years, which posed a big problem for the pre-human mother. The bigger brain allowed the baby to be smarter, and higher intelligence was highly selected for. There's a 0.4 correlation between the brain size and the IQ of a person. Bigger brains meant that women's birth canal needed to be wider so that the bigger-brained baby could pass through it at birth. Those women with smaller birth canal diameters were more likely to die. So women evolved to have wider birth canals, but there's an engineering structural constraint on this width, and that is that the stress fracture limit of the woman's hip bone. A hip fracture for a woman in those days was fatal, so women were put into a quandary, into a trade-off between the evolutionary push for smarter, larger-brained babies and the stress limit on hip bones. The way that evolution found to solve this quandary was to have the baby born prematurely, before the baby could mature enough to be able to walk and feed for itself soon after birth, so that the growth of the baby's head could continue after the premature birth. This premature birth trend solved the above problem, but in turn created a new problem, and that was the utter helplessness of the prematurely born infants. These infants were utterly useless, requiring constant attention from their mothers, who therefore needed to be constantly on hand to cater to the utter dependent needs of their helpless, useless infants. In other words, it became utterly impractical for such mothers to be racing around their habitat chasing game to bring back meat for the tribe. So how did early human females giving birth to helpless infants manage to obtain meat for themselves and their infants to survive? The next phase in this evolutionary saga was that women evolved to become prostitutes to men by being better able to bargain with men by offering men access to their vaginas in exchange for scarce male-hunted meat, especially in times of starvation, when such meat was hard to come by. Most female mammals have days of sexual heat, for example dogs and monkeys, when they are sexually hungry to be sexed. The human female evolved to become the sexiest of all mammals, in the sense of increasing the number of such days of sexual heat, in the sense of having all days of the month being in sexual heat, and thus being in a better, stronger position to be able to bribe men with sex in exchange for men's hunted meat.
You, man, give me, woman, your male-hunted meat, and I will give you my cunt.
Some men, through individual differences, became more sexually excited than most at the prospect of ejaculating inside her cunt than other men, and that the flood of pleasure hormones in his brain tended to swamp his ability to think rationally and coldly, making him more vulnerable to being manipulated by the cunt offering female. Since women were so vulnerable and so dependent on men, giving women scarce male-hunted meat for women and their babies to survive, women learned over time, several million years, to give their vaginas to men who suffered male frontal lobe switch-off more readily than other men. Women who did not suffer this phenomenon soon learned to prefer men who became blubbering idiots at the prospect of ejaculating in her to men who were more suspicious, more cautious of being tied down, more sexploited by dependent females who were desperate to find a man to provide her with meat for herself and her babies. The more suspicious men, those who were less prone to the male frontal lobe switch-off phenomenon, were sexually selected against by women, because such men were less controllable by women, so were given less access to women's vaginas than men, whose frontal lobes switched off more readily at the prospect of having his brain flooded with pleasure hormones, anticipating ejaculating inside a woman. Thus, the above evolutionary hypothesis claims that it was women's sexual selection, women's sexual preference for more manipulable men, more non-thinking, more pleasure hormone-driven men who were sexually preferred by women. Such men were more easily prostituted by women, more easily manipulated by women, who were much better able to use their female sexuality to sexploit men who turned into cunt-hungry idiots at the prospect of squirting into a woman's vagina, the source of supreme pleasure for him. After several million years of this, we arrived at what we have today, namely the phenomenon of the male frontal lobe switch-off, in which women had been sexually selecting such men for thousands of generations, so that women are able to coldly, rationally manipulate men with sex in order to be better able to sexploit men, to extract male resources from them, in order to benefit highly dependent women and their prematurely born babies. The masculists, that is, men's livers, claim that, in capital letters, all men should be informed of this male frontal lobe switch-off phenomenon. so that they become much more suspicious of women's sexual tricks to trap men into an unwanted pregnancy. Women evolve to want to have babies. It's women's deepest need. What women evolved to do, to be. Women are highly dependent on men for obtaining meat for their own survival and that of their helpless infants. I remember an incident in my own life when I met some young woman in her 30s with 3 kids whose husband had recently left her. She was quite a bit dumber than I was, so it was easy for me to see right through her. Her reaction towards me was classic female. She sensed I showed some interest in her. She was totally fluffy, who decided to have a 3rd baby rather than face the challenge of fipping up to the outside world by taking up the challenge of a paid career. Then her husband got fed up with her and walked out. She was utterly career incompetent and without money to support herself and her 3 kids, so her cunt went into overdrive to trap a man, a meat provider, as fast as possible. She threw herself at me, hoping I would fall into her trap. Fortunately for me, her behaviour and goal was so transparent that it was amusing watching her classic female tactics in action. Soon after, I left the country I was living in and went back to Europe, my spiritual home. I was surprised that independently she followed me to Europe with her small 3rd kid in tow. I had recently separated from my first wife and kids, so was not in a healthy mental state myself, so told this desperate fluffy female to go back home. I have enough problems of my own without you adding to them. That's what she did. I was told later that she then went around her social circle bad-mouthing me for dumping her. This incident reinforced in me, the budding masculist at the time, about 40 years ago, how dangerous women can be and how manipulative. Those young men reading/watching this now need to learn the lesson. To be very careful with women if you sense your frontal lobe switching off at the prospect of having sex with them. Women have been using their vaginas for millions of years to trap men into becoming manipulable meat providers for women and their babies. Women are able to coldly, rationally, logically use their vaginas to trap men into the role of paying for women, providing women with resources. Men and women do not share DNA. A man to a woman is ultimately a replaceable resource provider. She has no deep loyalty to a man. She evolved to be able to quickly, coldly, disloyally dump a man who stops providing her and her babies with male-hunted meat, or in today's terms, money. This disloyalty makes sense in evolutionary terms. Women's survival and that of her infants depended on her being like that. From a man's point of view, men need to be aware of the core message of the MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, namely that of the red pill, that is the idea that women don't love men for themselves. Women love men for men's sexploitability, that is men's ability to provide resources to women and their infants. This makes perfect Darwinian sense, but it's very dangerous to men. Men need to be very careful of the vagina trap that women use to ensnare men into undesired pregnancies, that is, undesired by the man, but desired by the woman. Women use men for their sperm and for men's resources. Women are parasites. Women are prostitutes to men, trading sex for men's resources. These are the basic facts of existence and relations between the sexes. Men see women largely as femalians, with brains designed for quite different purposes than men's brains. Women could not hunt, but men could, so men's brains evolved to understand and manipulate the world. Women's brains evolved to manipulate men, to extract resources from men. For example, the ability to manipulate the male phenomenon of frontal lobe switch-off that women do not have. Every man needs to be aware of the phenomenon of male frontal lobe switch-off, so to be fully conscious of what women are doing to men sexually, aiming to trap a man into giving her babies and paying for her to raise them. Masculism, that is men's lib, needs to educate men far more effectively about this female trap. Young men in particular, whose sexual hormones are at their strongest in their 20s, need to be taught by masculinist and MGTOW ideas that they have their brains turned to mush at the sight of the vagina and pubic hair of their regular sexual partner. Young men need to learn that the common strategy of young women is to fuck her boyfriend a lot early in the relationship, so that the phenomenon of male frontal lobe switch off is well established in him, so that she can then steadily, relentlessly brainwash him that his role in life is to work for her, be her manslave, providing her with resources, that she does not have to work, so that she can concentrate on what she wants to do, that is, raise her kids, who have half her DNA, to whom she has real genetic kinship, and who has none with her boyfriend/husband. If the boyfriend/husband ceases to provide resources, she will quickly, coldly, disloyally turn against him in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts and financially massacre him, stripping his kids from him, taking half his stuff, his house, extract child payments and often alimony, so that she can remain a parasite of him after the divorce as she was before the divorce. Young men really need to be informed about the phenomenon of the male frontal lobe switch off, so that they are less likely to blindly, ignorantly, stupidly fall into the sex trap set up by women. Men need to learn of this phenomenon so that they are able to get the sex they want from women without paying the huge price of becoming a blubbering, sexually manipulated man-slave to her. In capital letters, all men need to know about the phenomenon of the male frontal lobe switch off for their own protection. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 350 plus masculine